Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Sellgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. In 2003, James Buchanan, one of the fathers of public choice, wrote, quote, "Public choice may be summarized by the three-word description, quote, politics without romance," end quote. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today on May 4th, 2020, or Star Wars Day, or 2020, it's 2022. My head might be somewhere else. Today, I'm really excited to be talking to Randy Simmons about this. He's the director of the Institute of Political Economy at Utah State University and is the author of Beyond Politics. I wanted to talk about this book because so many people have said it's life-changing, have recommended it, and I think it's a great introduction to the topic of public choice, but it's also good for understanding what public choice is even about. Welcome, Randy.
Thank you.
So before we jump in, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Wow. Way to ask me a tough question. The most important thing about government is that we ask it to do more than it can, and certainly more than it should. When people say, "Oh, the government should do that," when their view of government is normally sort of like their view of unicorns. They believe that governments can do things they simply cannot. At least they can't do them well. And so at least from a public choice perspective, that might be the most important thing. Here's another way to say it, that people in economics claim that there are market failures, and therefore governments have to fix those market failures. And what they forget is that, or don't even understand, is that there are also government failures, and that most government attempts to fix market failures make things worse. In fact, that was the working title of the book Beyond Politics. It was the limits of, let's see, what was it? Anyway, the subtitle was On Making Things Worse.
Oh, that's funny. That would have been good. But speaking of, why is it called Beyond Politics? What exactly is Beyond Politics?
I didn't even understand this while I was in graduate school. It suddenly came to me that that most of what we ask governments to do, governments are simply unable to do. Now, let me back up. I spent 10 years in city government, 6 years as a member of the city council, and 4 years as mayor. And what I discovered there, in practical terms, is that governments can do a pretty good job of having a sewer system, having a water system. We were pretty good at at filling potholes and at collecting garbage. Now, what's interesting is all of those things can be done, in fact, better by private industry, but at least government can do those basic things. But when it comes to doing a lot more than that, it just fails. I was going to Oh, here's when Ronald Coase was he was the editor of the Journal of Law and Economics for forever, and Ronald Coase was a Nobel Prize winner. He said, what we discover is that most regulation does produce or has produced in recent times a worse result. When pushed to identify what he would consider a good regulation, an example of a not so good regulation, he responded, I don't know if there's a good one. He says that what happens is that when governments, especially national governments, operate on such a massive scale that they get to the point of diminishing marginal returns. Things get worse. And by the way, that doesn't mean that I think that local governments are really necessarily great either. I ended my time as after 10 years in city government, being a serious proponent of federalism because I want a state government restricting things that local governments can do. I want a national government restricting things that state governments and local governments can do, because once people are elected, they somehow become smarter than anyone around them. It just magically happens, like the next day. And they believe they know how to run things, even though they don't. I once gave a talk to the League of Cities and Towns. I called it this tells you how long ago it was. I called it the Yellow Pages test. There used to be phone books, Juliette. There were phone books. And in the back of the phone books were the Yellow Pages, which is where everybody all the businesses listed their businesses. And what I said was, if you can find a service in the Yellow Pages, then government should not be doing it, because the folks in the Yellow Pages can do it more efficiently. Today, you would just Google it and say, okay, who do I get to fix this pothole? But in the old days, like 20 years ago, there were Yellow Pages.
So I've just heard Beyond Politics described so many times as the best available primer on public choice. In fact, James Buchanan, who I quoted earlier, was also quoted to say, and some background listeners, he got a Nobel Prize in economic science and was an intellectual powerhouse of public choice. He wrote this about your book. He said, quote, "We have needed an answer to the question often asked, can you refer me to a single book that will explain in simple language what public choice is all about? Beyond Politics by William Mitchell and Randy Simmons meets this need superbly," end quote. Why is it so important to communicate the concepts within public choice and to do it in a simple way to the public?
Well, because it's not intuitive. If people sit back and think about it, it's completely intuitive. But basically, we have in many ways a romantic vision of government. We believe governments can do good things. We believe that governments ought to do good things, and maybe they should. But the next question is, can they in fact do them? And so it's useful to explain in very simple terms that when people go from the supermarket to the voting booth, they are still the same people, and they're still going to be motivated out of their own interests as opposed to others' interests. When someone's elected to office, what drives them? Primarily, what drives them is getting reelected. If you're in the House of Representatives in the United States, for example, the day after the election, you start your reelection campaign. And the calculus for deciding on how to vote is often a calculus. Is this going to win me? If I'm going to vote this way on this policy, is this going to win me votes in my district, or is it going to lose me votes? And if once we realize that that politicians and voters and bureaucrats and interest groups are actively involved in the game of politics, pursuing their own interests, then we understand that the public interest is not served very well, and often only by happenstance. But we think when somebody goes into politics, they do it for a noble cause, a noble purpose, and many do. But the problem is that the vote calculus soon dominates their thinking.
So, well, I was just going to say, what are the main ways that we, and even economists, romanticize politics? I mean, obviously, we think they should be doing these things, but are there any examples of the main ways where we fail to see the reality?
We believe that markets are going to fail to make people better off, that they'll only make some people better off and other people worse off. I think in those terms, probably the worst thing that is generally believed is that markets are a zero-sum game, or a sometimes negative sum, that everything that I win in a market, I steal from you. When markets aren't that way at all. In order for me to make myself better off, I have to offer you something that's going to make you better off. So trade is win-win as opposed to win-lose, but we believe that it's win-lose, and that's why people get so upset that some people make a lot of money. It's the envy that drives them is because they believe those people gained their money unethically, and that we should therefore take it away from them without ever thinking, well, what are the incentives we're going to create when we take things away? So it's that sort of viewing markets as win-lose as opposed to win-win is, I think, the biggest thing.
And I mean, so that's a lot of the time what people refer to as like a market failure, and you think there's a market failure, you think the market will fail, and so then you want government to intervene. And you mentioned it before, but government does fail. It happens. And I mean, often when they go to fix a quote unquote market failure, whether or not it really is something that should be pursued or not, it fails worse. What are the main factors that are overlooked by the majority of people that would explain why government fails?
Well, the first thing is that governments, when governments try to create policies, they don't have the sort of knowledge of the local knowledge to understand how those policies are going to affect people at the local level. You think in a grand scheme, and you end up you don't see that important knowledge of time and place. I'll give you a quick example. I worked in the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C. for a few years, and I was in the Office of Policy Analysis, assigned to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which, by the way, may be the worst agency in the United States. When I was assigned to them, they were talking about what to do about scholarships for students to go to college. And here were the rules. You didn't have to have a minimum high school GPA. You didn't have a set time. You could go to school for 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 years and still get the scholarship. You didn't have to maintain a minimum GPA. And you didn't have to take a minimum number of hours. And if you dropped out during the semester, the tuition refund came to you, not back to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Think about all of the bad incentives that are there. And so I suggested that they look at what the Navajo Nation does with its scholarships. You have to have a 2.0 high school GPA. you can only have the scholarship for 6 years. You have to maintain a 2.0 GPA while you're in college, and you have to take, I think it's either 10 or 12 credit hours each semester. And the folks at the Bureau of Indian Affairs thought, well, this is great. Let's do what the Navajos do. So sounded wonderful to me. I come back to my university, and I'm teaching in my first. Actually, we were on quarters then, not semesters. But my first quarterback, I get a kid in my class who's off of the Ute reservation, and the education he got from the Bureau of Indian Affairs was terrible, absolutely terrible. And this is a kid who was smart, motivated. He wanted to do good things in his life, and he simply could not carry more than 6 or 8 credit hours. He needed to have so much remedial work that it was going to take him a long time to get through college. So I think I've done a great thing as a bureaucrat, and I come back and I discovered that I've ruined this kid's life because he cannot get through college under the rules that I got the Bureau of Indian Affairs to impose. We just don't have that sort of local knowledge that's necessary when creating policies. And the other thing that happens is that policies aren't created in a vacuum. We don't just sit back and think, oh, what's the right thing to do? You've got all kinds of interest groups wanting to have their ideas pushed or their industries benefited. And those things get written into law. I have another example of that. My son was the assistant secretary in the Department of Energy for energy efficiency and renewable energy. And he called me to tell me about what had happened to his agency's budget in one of the budget rounds. And the House had, I think, allocated something like $1.8 billion to his agency. The Senate allocated, when the bill went over to the Senate increased that to 1.8. And so then what happens is when things are different between the House and Senate, they go to a conference committee, and the conference committee can do lots of interesting things there. But one of the things they did is he said, I was allocated 1.2 and then 1.8, and it went to conference and they split the difference and gave me 2.2 billion. And that was simply because there were some lobbyists who were working with people in the conference committee wanting more money put into renewable energy. So it wasn't what the House had voted. It wasn't what the Senate had voted. It was more than either of them had voted. And it's just that's what makes up the bills that we get out of a Congress or a legislature.
Wow. I just can't even wrap my head around how that's possible and why we let that sort of thing fly. But I think most people don't even know because it's kind of out of reach. But wow, that is some overreach right there. Those are great examples. I was going to ask for some examples, but there we go. Wow. That is so fascinating. So, okay, kind of a little off topic. Is there any other, obviously the picture you've painted of where you worked in DC it's not a pretty picture, but why else do you think it's the worst?
Oh, the Bureau of Indian Affairs?
Yeah.
It's the worst because they treat Native American tribes as children. They create rules that are based in some strange ideology sometimes, or some belief about how Native Americans lived, and as if there is this one group called Native Americans. These are all people from very different tribes and histories, and because of that, they're not one people. They're just so many different, but we treat them all really broadly as one. So here's an an example of what happens on the Navajo reservation because of rules that were created by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So when the Navajos were forced onto the reservation, people got actually title to some of the property. But the rules that were set up were such that if I got property and I have 2 children, each of them gets half of my property. And then if each of them has 2 children, those children get half of what their parents got, and on and on and on. So you can have a piece of property that has over 100 different owners, and any one of them can stop any kind of development. So if I was asked by one of the areas of the reservation to help them put together an economic development plan, and we went down there, and they needed some space for like a laundromat. But the problem was, how do you get someone to put in a laundromat when you can't even get property to put it on? And then, by the way, it takes 5 years for you to get a business license approved. And it's mind-boggling. If you want to go to the developing world or the not developing world, just go to almost any reservation in the Western United States. It's amazing how bad things are. And it gets promoted and perpetuated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I really dislike them. Can you tell?
Wow. I mean, it sounds like it's with good reason. That's government. I wish I could say that I was more shocked, but I'm not that surprised, sadly. So back to public choice. Well, I guess it's kind of related. Public choice also explains how political decision-making results have outcomes that are costly. I mean, with the example with the budget and how they got more money than what anyone in Congress even said. It's costly and it's inefficient and it's unfair. And to me, the first thing that really comes to mind is cronyism. Why do you think that people don't see how unfair it is that government allocates so many favors and subsidies to not just like businesses, but even like if you want to go big businesses, they give so many like carve outs and favors to big businesses. Why don't people think or see that that's unfair? And then when they do, why do they blame businesses instead of blaming the government?
Well, one reason is that, all of us are living our lives, and we only know of particular benefits from government if we get them. We don't know about ones that other people get. Did you know that you pay more than twice and sometimes 4 times the world price for sugar?
What? I did not know that.
No, you didn't know that. But there are sugarcane raisers in Florida who make millions of extra dollars because of the import restrictions on cane sugar from especially the Caribbean. And so they make millions, and we don't pay, it costs us, $20 more a year individually for sugar? We don't know. And we're not going to organize to go to Washington to say, stop this stupid subsidy because it's only costing us $20. It's not going to make a huge difference in our lives to organize, but it sure makes a huge difference in the lives of those farmers. And so most things in politics of the sort you're talking about are like that. The benefits are concentrated and the costs are dispersed. And because the costs are dispersed across everybody, we don't even see them. We don't recognize them as really being costs. But because we concentrate the benefits on the particular groups, then the people who are in those groups have an incentive to know about it and to encourage Congress to keep spending it. And there are always claims that it's in the public good. It's in the public interest to be doing this, and then they explain why, and it sounds reasonable. But it's when you add it all up, we end up with the kind of budget that we have. If the individual pieces of the budget had to be voted on individually, we would have a much smaller budget. But instead, what we have is this big, what political scientists sometimes call a Christmas tree budget bill, where you have the bare bones, and then everybody gets to hang their own ornaments on the tree in order to get other people to vote for. So I'll vote for your ornament if you'll vote for mine. That is, if I'll vote for this benefit in your district if you vote for the benefit in my district. And so all of this trading of votes across these different kinds of issues ends up with Christmas tree bills, or we also call it pork barrel politics. But it's no one has an incentive to figure it out and do anything about it. Almost no one. If you are, if you're part of those people who get cost dispersed, but you have a huge incentive if you're getting the particular benefits.
Yeah, I remember learning in government class a few years ago about, we were introduced to it as the Christmas tree bill. And the examples, I wish I could remember them, but the examples that my teacher brought, and we went through like a list of all of these really, 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 really random allocations of money to random people and businesses and groups. And it was just like so shocking because it was so nichely specific. It just really shows how much of a hold interest groups have on government. And you're right. I mean, it is shocking just how much, I don't know, like how incentivized you are to do that, because you can get away with something like that and it is possible. Are there particular institutions, though, that are preferred by public choice scholars to address some of the problems like that?
Well, as I mentioned, I became a fan of federalism. If we read in the Federalist Papers, we read Federalist 10, didn't end up doing things the way that they had hoped. But yeah, having different powers allocated to different forms of government, and so that they can be a check and a balance against each other, that's the sort of thing that gets promoted. Jim Buchanan wrote I'm looking at a book on my shelf right now. It's called Freedom and Constitutional Contract. He believed that constitutions were terribly important and that we could restrain government through contracts or constitutions. One of the things that can happen when you create a constitution is that you can limit the powers of the government. Now, we have done, in some areas, done fairly well at that in the United States. In other areas, not so much. But there's a continual pressure to expand the power and scope and reach of government, and very little momentum to restrict it. And so we end up with like the healthcare system that we have today, which is fully messed up, but not as messed up as it could be. And not as messed up as, say, the Canadian system or the English system. It's so just the restrictions on the scope of government are probably the best thing that can happen. The trick is, how do you get those restrictions in place, and how do you keep them in place? It's hard. A public choice economist or political scientist would want to restrict the sorts of things that we can vote on, because democracy, it turns out, is not a good form of government, but it's as Winston Churchill said, it's better than the others. The question is, should we what sorts of things should people be able to vote on? Should we be able to vote? Should I be able to vote on whether or not my neighbor can build a new building on his property? Should I be able to vote on where roads go? Sound like reasonable things possibly, but that sort of democratic expansion of the franchise, expanding the scope of things that we can vote on, really becomes a tyranny of the majority. And what's interesting in the Federalist Papers, the American founders were far more interested in the tyranny of the majority than they were in other forms of tyranny. And so that's why they wanted a government where powers were restricted and there were checks against different levels of government.
Why do you think that public choice continues to be ignored by so many economists and so many political scientists? I mean, you made a good case for why it makes sense for the public, right? It doesn't really affect any one of us a ton, but I mean, $20 a year extra for sugar. I mean, the thought of it is more annoying than the actual $20 probably. But you would hope more for economists.
Well, so public choice started primarily among a group of economists. The first people who started thinking about these things they developed an academic journal, and they called it Papers in the Theory of Non-Government Decision-Making, something like that. I mean, terrible title. But what they meant was, let's think about how people in government act. And let's use the same tools that we use in economics. That is, let's assume that people are rational. That is, that they're goal-oriented. They have goals. They try to achieve them. They're more interested in achieving their goals than somebody else's goals. They respond to incentives. Those, basic fundamental assumptions that are in economics. Now, among political scientists, that was something completely new at the time, and also was viewed as imperialism by the economists. So, economists trying to take over our discipline, and there was huge pushback in political science. And so really didn't make many inroads. It's made more inroads now than it was, say, 20 years ago. But among economists, what was going on at the same time is that economists they had physics envy. They wanted to be able to develop these complex mathematical models, and doing the modeling became more important than actually understanding the world, I believe. And so much of economics became recreational math. And so they weren't necessarily motivated by theory, by understanding, broad concepts behind the economy. They wanted to do math and make these little tiny marginal differences in their models, and you got rewarded for publishing in, like the journal Econometrica, and for being a really good mathematician as opposed to being good at thinking about how the world actually works. I have a colleague who's a macroeconomist, and he's completely honest about it. He says, all of my publication is in macro models. I live inside my computer. My models work really well inside my computer. They don't reflect the real world at all. But
Jeez.
He gets all of his papers published. So it was, if you think about economists who tried to understand how the world works, let's start with Adam Smith. And I mean, we can go clear back to Plato and Aristotle as people who were trying to figure out how people interact, how people actually live together, which is what economists should be trying to do. That's what Adam Smith was trying to do. But so there's this whole, but that sort of vision of economics sort of fell out of favor as the mathematicians took over. I don't know that that's a correct answer to your question. It's the answer that makes sense to me.
I think that's a good answer. What is the most surprising thing that you learned from public choice?
Wow. That good intentions are not enough. That so my undergraduate degree was in political science. My graduate degree was in political science. Luckily, I worked with one of those people who founded the Public Choice Society. There were like 3 political scientists, and the rest were all economists. But I had this kind of romantic view of politics that if we just have good intentions, we can make good things happen. And good intentions are, we need to not look at the intentions of those who are creating a bill. We need to look at the incentives that are created by that bill and how, and if it will actually accomplish what it wants. Because most regulation ends up as I said earlier, making things worse, not making things better. Even though most regulation is rooted in someone's good intentions.
You seem to have spent some time with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then obviously now you do a lot of public choice and you're at a university. How did you get there? What is the relationship between all of that?
Well, dumb luck. So much of life is serendipity. And just the people you meet along the way, and the opportunities that they create for you. So I had the person who was the director of the Office of Policy Analysis and Interior was an academic friend who I'd met at a couple of conferences, and he called me and said, "Hey, I'd like some help in DC. How'd you like to come and spend a few years?" Well, of course, yes. It was like getting a second PhD in terms of the education I got out of it. And then I just happened to have good and interesting colleagues, both at my university and people I had met elsewhere that I was able to do work with. And that, again, it's just a lot of that was luck. And then when I went into city government, it's because I was so irritated at the people who were there. I assumed, I can't screw it up as badly as they are. So, and so I did that. And by the way, I could have been mayor for a lot longer. But I discovered my public choice training kicked in, and I realized that I really liked being called Mr. Mayor. I liked the deference that people were giving me. So when I'm cynical about people who are in public office, it's because I've been there and I know the kinds of sort of pressures you didn't expect or you don't even recognize if you're not looking for them. But when I started thinking about the city as being an entity instead of being comprised of all of these individual citizens, I realized this is corrupting me. So I didn't run again. But I don't know that I would have recognized that without my public choice training, without thinking seriously about what's happening and how is this system working.
Wow. I've heard so many stories of people who have spent time in office and in government saying that even if you come in with the purest, best intentions, it does, like, if you pay attention, you can feel it changing the way you think, changing the way you feel, changing your behavior. And it's kind of scary in a way. I wish that we had more time, but we don't. So I'm going to ask you one final question. What is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Yeah. I'm 72, so I don't remember. That's a bad excuse. I believed that good intentions were sufficient to make good things happen. And they're not. It requires, just preaching about doing the right thing doesn't work. You have to have incentives in place that encourage people to do the right thing. And by that, I mean, that's why I want to restrict the sorts of things that government can do, because it's likely to be overused and abused. I didn't realize that when I was in college and as an undergraduate. I was a political science major. I thought the governments did great things. So I've become far more cynical about the ability to make things better.
Do you think that, I don't know, do you think that we're all doomed? I hope not. I have grandkids, so I hope that their world will be better. Actually, if you look at sort of macro topics, there are fewer terribly poor people in the world today than there were 10 years ago, even though we have a lot more people. We have, governments do some stupid things like all of the spending that was done by the current administration, the previous administration, basically everybody since George W. Bush. And so right now we're going to be living through a period of inflation, and there's going to be a recession, but we'll recover. The economy is resilient because people are resilient. We figure out ways to get things done, even though government tries to get in the way. And so I'm actually really quite optimistic about the state of the world. Yes, we have Mr. Putin, but he'll pass. We have China going backwards instead of forwards the way they have for the last 30 or 40 years. But I expect that'll change. The pressures from doing dumb things eventually overcome the dumb things. And so things get better. I had always thought that free speech was something that would be always respected in the United States. It's not now, but I believe it'll get better. I'm optimistic about people and our ability to work around, improve, and go about living our lives. And so, yeah, I'm cynical about what government does, but I'm not cynical about people. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests, or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.